I forgot to start the TV show last week. All right, we'll begin with a reading from Deuteronomy 18, the words of Moses. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. You shall heed such a prophet. This is what you requested of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, if I hear the voice of the Lord my God any more and evermore, see this great fire, I will die. Then the Lord replied to me, they are right in what they have said. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their own people. I will put my words in the mouth of the prophet, who shall speak to them everything I command. Anyone who does not heed the words of the prophet shall speak in my name. I myself will hold accountable. But any prophet who speaks in the name of other gods or presumes to speak in my name a word that I have not commanded the prophet to speak, the prophet shall die. You may say to yourself, how can we recognize a word that the Lord has not spoken? If a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, but the thing does not take place or prove to be true, it is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. Do not be frightened by it. Ominous words for the period of the judges coming up. Let's pray. Lord, favor this dwelling place with your presence. Far from it repulse the wiles of Satan. Your holy angels, let them live here to keep us in peace. And may your blessing remain upon us always. This we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, here we are back in Judges. So, it's time to begin at the beginning since I began at the end. And, yep, I know. So as we continue to explore Judges, one more week of introduction before we get to the fun stuff, right? Because what we covered the last few weeks from 17 through 21 was not fun stuff, it was gory stuff. And so just remember the theme that runs through this. In those days, there was no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So at the beginning of Judges in chapter 1, it is the end of the life of Joshua. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, God, in God's infinite wisdom, chose not to have a succession plan for Joshua like he did for Moses. So, the question at the very outset of this little exercise was, can autonomy work? Well, we're about to find out. If the end of the book is any indication, the answer is no. It's a mess. It's chaos. It's humanism. But to be fair to the judges, we have to give them a chance, right? So we will give them a chance. Keep in mind, I still want you to be able to answer the question, not only can autonomy work, but does God favor the monarchy? Does he approve of a king? Because that is the cry. There's nobody to tell us what to do, therefore we'll do what we want to do. But if we just had a king, it would surely be better. That's a bit of my paraphrase. Don't answer the question tonight. It's merely rhetorical for now. So, here's what I want to do with Judges. After the 3 weeks really covering the last 5 chapters to show the mindset, the ethic, the morality or the lack thereof of God's people during this dark period, we'll turn back to the beginning and actually look at chapters 1 and 2. That heinous ending of Judges begins with the generation after the death of Joshua. And remember, there's no succession plan. So there's a question that comes up at the very beginning of Judges. Who's going to go up for us? In other words, who's going to step up to the plate? Who's going to be the next person up when your star quarterback broke their ankle? Who's going to be the warrior when your 5-star general said, yeah, I'm done. I think I'll go buy an inn in Vermont. All right. Those of you who watch White Christmas. So that's where the text starts. We have a nation without a leader who clamors for a leader. Who's going to go up first? Who's going to lead us? We'll answer that question in a moment. So before we start, let me give you some things that we're going to look at in Judges. 6 major components of this saga. The first is Israel. Remember, this book is written to and about God's covenant people. Right? The bad guys here are God's people. And the good guys here are God's people. And it's written and given to us. And this is the covenant people of God, and I would propose the 3rd and 4th plus generation since Egypt. First generation dies in the wilderness. Second generation's entered under Joshua, begins the conquest, which we'll pick up a little bit of that. Next generation had a little bit of the people who were part of the second generation, and then you get to the 4th generation. This is all new territory. So, Israel's a major piece of this. But when we read Israel, when we read about them, this is us. This is God's covenant people. Okay. Second major component is the land, Canaan, promised to Abram and Abraham, almost given away multiple times by Abraham, and then vacated by Jacob for a long time, 400 years, as Jacob went to Egypt. The land is more than the dirt, okay? The land, in Judges especially, is the place where the covenant community hangs out. It's the dwelling place of God's people, and it is also the access to life. They are an agrarian people. You don't have land, you don't eat. Right? You don't have land, you don't have shelter. So, it's not just about conquering dirt and planting the flag. It's survival. The land's tied to survival. Third component. This is the one that gets a little bit tricky for me. The Canaanites.
They're still there.
Yeah, they're still there. We have, I think, a view of the Canaanites in Judges and in Joshua, that these are the bad nations that God hates. Keep in mind that in the conquest, there's kind of 3 aspects of the conquest. There is the military brute force, which you see some in Joshua, Jericho, Ai, Hatzor, those towns. There is a integrating in through proselyting. Rahab leaves Jericho, joins up. I think that happens more than is recorded. As a matter of fact, it happens quite a lot. So you got some people coming in saying, hey, we've heard stories. Your God defeated Pharaoh. Your God made water stop running at flood stage. We're probably on the wrong team here. We'll get on the right team. So you got that. And then you got coexist. I think that's a good word, Jim. Coexistence. You got Canaanites living next door to Israelites, who, by the way, are Canaanites in their own way. They speak a Canaanite language. I think it's best to see the Canaanites this way in Judges. Canaanites is not about just about a particular group of people that God doesn't like. It's about a system a sociological and a political system that oppresses, that perpetuates violence on others, and especially a system that's in place that is in opposition to the ethic of God. They had a city-state system, not nearly as advanced as the Greek city-state system, but they had one in place. They had walled cities, obviously. As I mentioned, many of the Canaanites actually joined Israel in the period of, acquisition, conquest, displacement, whatever you want to call that period. But to just automatically characterize them as the enemies of God, I think, is not the way to approach it. It's not the people. It's the system and what the system produces that puts them in opposition. The fourth thing, Ed Cole mentioned this. He read Judges. You know what he said? There's a lot of violence in that book. There is violence. And though violence is certainly highlighted and featured throughout the book of Judges does not condone violence. It actually condemns it. But I will say this about violence and about society. Any society that is permeated with oppression or is sold the idea of oppression, violence is a natural outflow of that. When people feel oppressed, you know what they do? They lash out. They may cower for a while. They may go into a depression. But eventually, if you're oppressed long enough, you know what you're going to do? You are going to punch back. Right? And again, it doesn't matter if that is what I call real oppression or perceived oppression. It's real oppression. And you know what? It's easy to sell oppression. And we've experienced some of this in our culture, by the way. The violence that came out following the George Floyd death and the violence that happened on January 6th at the Capitol is people feeling the weight of oppression. Again, whatever that looks like, and it looks like it's different in those two situations, but it is an outflow of that. And again, I'm not condoning it, nor does Judges condone it, but it is a reality. It happens in families too. You oppress your spouse, they're going to fight back. You oppress your kids, they're going to react. It happens in church families. You oppress God's people, they're going to push back. Again, whatever that oppression looks like, violence, reactionary things are going to happen. I don't like it, but it is. And so part of Judges is that. It is the description of what happens in oppression. Part of it. And it is violent. Gruesome. Here's the fifth component, and it's women. Women play a major role in the book of Judges. It is my opinion that, at least initially, the book of Judges elevates the status of women more than any other Old Testament book. It is more egalitarian in its approach. But what happens as the generations get further and further away from the Joshua generation is how women are viewed gets more and more repressive till by the end, this is why I wanted to start at the end, it is awful, right? So in Judges, women go from heroes to abused victims in the span of the book. But I think, by the way, part of what was hope, what they would hope would happen, is that in a monarchy, that what we see at the end of the book of Judges is going to go away and women's are going to be elevated again. But you know what? That doesn't happen in the monarchy either, unfortunately. But as we go through, we'll see, early on especially, women play a key role in this book, and they're very prominently and positively featured. It just gets worse as it goes on. Here's the last thing, and you're going to think I am crazy, but that's okay. As I told the Monday class, I've been tested, and I am crazy. So, there is a great deal of humor in this book, albeit dark humor. There's sarcasm in here. It's hard to read that, right? It's hard to read sarcasm on a flat page in a translated language. But there's some really, this is just me, okay? This will show you I'm a little off. There's some funny stuff in here in its own dark way, right? But it is dark. But if you live in that kind of darkness, in that kind of oppression, and in that kind of lack of moral compass, sometimes the only way you can get through is laugh at it, right? Because you finally cry the tears out. And you throw, you just laugh. And I liken it to, in some ways, if you've ever gotten tickled at a funeral when you weren't supposed to, and you couldn't stop laughing at it, right? I remember the first time that happened to me was at my grandmother's funeral. I mean, I got tickled. And it was not a funny thing, right? It was something oddly humorous about what was going on to me there. I couldn't stop laughing. And maybe that was just a bad reaction, not knowing how to deal with grief or whatever as a kid. But so I might just let you figure those out, because if I tell you what I think's funny, then you're probably going to think more awful of me than you might already. So, what's that? You'll start judging me. Although I will share one of those with you in a minute, just to kind of give you an example. So those things: Israel, the land, the Canaanites, violence, women, and humor. We'll touch on off and on through this, and we'll keep coming back to the question. Who's going to come up next? Does autonomy work? Does God put a stamp of approval on the monarchy? Okay. As we go through this. So, here's how the book starts. Is that enough? That's plenty. Do what you want to with that information. Judges has an interesting introduction. It has two prologues. Or two introductions. There's another Old Testament book that has two introductions, and that's Genesis. Genesis 1 tells the creation account from the view of a transcendent God, a God who's above creation, speaks and things happen. The Spirit's hovering over the dark and the deep. And then Genesis chapter 2 is a God who's immanent, who's involved in creation, plays in the dirt, builds stuff, breathes on stuff. So you get the same story in Genesis 1 from 2 of creation from two different perspectives. Same thing happens in Judges. You get two prologues or two introductions to the book. The first introduction is chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2 and verse 5. And that's Israel's perspective, human perspective. The second introduction is chapter 2, verse 6 through chapter 3, verse 6. That's God's perspective, a more divine perspective of the book. So, here's what you get in the first prologue. There's a leadership void. So, let me say it this way. In imperialistic societies, when there's a leadership void, what happens? Really doesn't even have to be imperialistic. Somebody's going to fill it, right? Right. That's right. Nature abhors a vacuum. Right. There is in every society there is a Darwinian attitude that somebody's going to grab the power, right? It doesn't seem to exist here at the beginning. Now, it gets that way. The question is, who's going to go? It's almost as if, well, we're kind of here now. We've got some things going. Do we really have to finish this? Who's going to lead us? There's a leadership void or a vacuum. And so the question is asked, who's going to go? Well, God does make a decision. So here's the succession plan. Hey, Judah, not a person, but what? A tribe of people, right? And that comes as an outflow from Genesis 49, when Jacob begins to pass blessings on the son, and Judah's going to rise up in prominence. Now, there's some things that happen along the way with Judah, the person, and then this is conferred on Judah, the tribe. It's the tribe of which Jesus will come through. It's the one who's going to have the lion's whelp and the scepter, that is, going to lead. So God assigns that task to the tribe of Judah. Not a person, but a group of people. And remember, I think somebody brought this out Monday, when the camp moved in the wilderness, Judah leads. Judah's leading. I'm not sure Judah wanted the job, but Judah got the job. But the Lord said, right? And so you still have a generation, by the way, that is attuned to the voice of God, that has followed Joshua, that is not like the first generation who griped and complained and died in the wilderness. Right? You still got people involved that are willing to listen to God and be led by God. So, Judah does what good leaders do, goes and recruits Simeon. And by the way, the conquest of Canaan is far from over. The Canaanite city-states are still there, still thriving, probably still doing a little oppressing, still polytheistic, lots of gods running around, or not running around, but on the shelf, so to speak. So Judah rallies the troops, makes an agreement with Simeon. You help me, I'll help you, we'll finish this thing. And there's some initial success. So one of the funny things, if I'll show you, this is where the dark humor is they capture a guy by the name of Adonai Bezek, the Lord of Bezek. Adonai, or master of Bezek. And they defeat him. And when they capture him, they do something really weird. They cut off his thumbs and his big toe. So why, I mean, that's kind of funny, right? Dark. Apparently that's what he did. Yeah, so those of you, so why in the world would you, what are you really saying? This will show you the mindset of the Canaanites, by the way, this oppressive idea. He said he'd done that to 70 people. So what happens if you cut off thumbs and a big toe? What happens to a human when you do that? Yeah. So, right? So what separates us? The opposing thumb, right? You've just limited something with the hands. And what happens when you cut off your big toe? You become a weeble, right? You wobble. And you probably fall down. Or you got to build something to help you. Or you got to have a crutch. Or you got to have somebody. So what Bezek does is make humans inhuman. They can't work the way they normally would. I'm not sure what it would be to try to grab a hoe or an axe and work without a thumb. Could you do it? You'd have to have some pretty strong, right? Certainly could swing a golf club, right? So, what's that? Yeah, or a sword. You couldn't handle a sword, right? So there is what you see in Bezek is you see oppression through humility. And then now he's conquered. So God, they do that, and then he dies. It's a little bit funny, right? Just to kind of get the picture. What's funny is the description. 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. And, all right, it's only fair that God does that to me. It's got its own form of humor to me. So, told you it was dark humor, but humor nonetheless. So what happens then after initial success? There's a story of Caleb. Okay. And Caleb, who is Joshua and Caleb fame, Caleb, the two of the original that leave Egypt that get to go into Canaan. Caleb's 85 when the conquest starts. Not sure how old he is now, older than that. Or maybe not, because this kind of looks back at Hebron. And Moses, remember, promised him a mountain at Hebron. Well, there's some work to do before you can get to Hebron. You got to clear out the riffraff that's around Hebron so he can go. So Caleb does something. He offers up his daughter. So here's the first look at women, and it doesn't look very positive. He offers her up as a door prize if somebody can go and wipe out and take this area. Whoever is macho enough to go take care of this, then you can marry my daughter. We'll arrange that. And so this city, and somebody captures it. Othniel captures it, and his daughter's offered. Her name, by the way, here's something else that's funny. It's a little bit of humor. Her name is Aksa, right? Which means ankle bracelet or jewelry. Okay. Eye candy, bling, whatever you want to call that. She does something really unique in this story. Again, more egalitarian. She goes to her dad and says, "Hey, give me a wedding present." What do you want? Well, they're in the Negev. The Negev is the desert. That's the southern part of Judah. If you live in the desert, what do you need more than anything else? Water. She's very shrewd, right? You know what? I'm no piece of jewelry here. I'm smart. She had boldly asked her dad for water. And you know what? Caleb gives it to her. He appreciates her asking. There's something really inherently powerful about that. If you're in the sales business, you know what the old mantra is, right? If you don't make any calls, you don't get any sales. Right? If you don't ask, you don't get. She's bold enough to ask, which is, by the way, very counterintuitive for that culture. And Caleb recognizes that and gives it to her. So, we get a pretty nice story to the beginning of the book of Judges. We get military conquest. We get an elevation of status of women. And then we get to the perspective. Remember, this is all from the perspective of Israel. Then you get to the failures. And what the overarching perspective of Israel is we failed in the military conquest. So you get paragraph after Caleb goes to Hebron and gets his mountain, then you get everybody who didn't do their thing. Benjamites don't get rid of the Jebusites at Jerusalem. They stayed there, by the way, till David. Joseph goes up against Bethel, and things happen, and they don't, right? They don't quite get everything. And then the rest of the chapter is they didn't do this, they didn't do this, they didn't do this, they didn't do this. And it's all about getting the Canaanites out of the city. Some of them they make into forced labor. Okay? I would say this. When God looks upon that forced labor, what he says is that's a form of collaboration. You're using them for your own good, And if you keep them around, what's going to happen? What happens in Judges 17 through 21, it's going to happen to your own people. The atrocities that are committed all come from an outflow of what I called religious syncretism. That is, they begin to bring all this attitude of the Canaanites in with them. You're working for me, you're my employee, so to speak, and I'm going to be influenced by you. That's what happens. And so in the first prologue, the perspective is we failed. Okay. Yes, sir. Got something?
This struck me in those first few verses. I mean, the Lord said Judah should go up. When he turns around and says, okay, but Simeon should go with me. Is that all right? I mean, I heard Judah go do it, and he turns around and asks Simeon. I don't know. There doesn't seem to be any repercussions from that immediately, but it just struck me.
Yeah, so that's why I asked, does autonomy work? I mean, what was supposed to happen? Were they supposed to help each other? Were they just supposed to take care of their own business? Right? No succession plan, no details. I mean, it seems to be a good thing, right? He's cooperating with the neighbor, and I help you, you help me. It seems to be. It doesn't seem to work in the long run, right? That's why I wanted to read that thing about the prophets to begin with, from Deuteronomy. You know, we have no, other than one little aspect about Bethel, we've got no, let's go check with God and see what we need to do. And maybe that's intentionally left out. Maybe it does happen. But what you get as an outflow of that is just, it doesn't work. Everybody's still around. Ephraim doesn't do what they're supposed to do, and neither does Zebulun, neither does Asher, and neither does Naphtali, neither does Dan. Remember, Dan finally picks up and moves, which we looked at. So you get a perspective from Israel. We didn't get it done. Canaanites are still here. Everything that the Canaanites stand for is still here. We did cut the thumbs and toes off of the king, right? Maybe that's your bright spot. And so that's the first prologue. The second prologue is more, I think, a divine perspective. And there's some things that we need to look at. So it picks back up with the death of Joshua again in verse 6, right? And here's what we get. I think this is important. So when Joshua dismissed the people of Israel went each his own inheritance to take possession of the land. It's kind of what Brandon said. Everybody seemed to go do their own thing, right? And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua. And notice when else? All the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had all seen the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And then Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. They bury him. And then all the generation were gathered. That is, this next group died. They gathered with their fathers. And then you get another generation. And this is a key one. And then there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work he had done for Israel. That is, no firsthand experience of Egypt and manna and quail and rivers stopping and walls falling down with trumpets being blown, and I'm going to be a hornet to those people, and I'm going to be a warrior for you. No Moses, no tablets, no pillar of fire, no cloud. They don't experience any of that. So what happens? They don't know God. It's not this. Listen, do they know about God? Do they know the stories? Yeah, we got that, right? Well, they know the stories. They know they were in Egypt. They knew the stories of Moses and the plagues, and they knew the stories of the crossing of the sea, and they knew the stories of the crossing of the Jordan. Matter of fact, they can go to the banks of the Jordan and see the story. The monument's still there. Right? The rocks are still there that was built. They didn't experience the testing from God during the wilderness. They got to go in and live in houses they didn't have to build. They got to harvest crops that they didn't have to plant. They got to drink water from wells that they didn't have to dig. Now, they got no skin in the game. They probably didn't have to go fight. By this time, it's this there. It is. We coexist. We live alongside. We're putting our weapons down, so to speak. And you know what? They probably don't adhere to and embrace the instruction of God. They got lazy. They got complacent. They got comfortable. Right? Nobody's bothering us anymore. We're good. That's right. And so what 2:6 through 3:6 is about is religious failure. If the first prologue is about military failure or conquest failure or however you want to call that, the second prologue is about religious failure. You got a group that doesn't know God. So I'll get to that and what happens as an outflow of that in just a minute. So the time that we live in has been dubbed by some as a post-Christian age. Right. A generation, I've even heard it called, a generation who knows not God. I'd say a lot of people know about God. Right. I know non-believers that know this Exodus story. Right? They watched it. They watched the Ten Commandments. Right. Right. They watched the greatest story ever told. They watched the Passion of the Christ. Know about God. But remember, these are God's people we're talking about. These aren't the Canaanites we're talking about who don't know God. These are God's covenant people who don't know God. So, where does that leave us? Because to know, yada in Hebrew, has to carry with it more than just mental acumen, okay? Information. It has to do with experience and how we relate, and it has to do with relationship. And so there's failure. There's no relationship with God. Because you know why? If you got everything you need, what do you need God for? Sound familiar? Right. You got everything you need. You got a place to live. You got plenty of food to eat. You got water to drink. What do you need God for? You didn't have to be tested. It's better, right? No hardship, no trial. Life's comfortable. Life is easy. This is the good life. And then the outflow of that is an abandonment of God. We don't need you anymore. We don't need you. Listen, my house is almost paid for. My IRA's in great shape. My kids are grown. They're not bothering me anymore. They only come back to visit and they bring gifts. And they bring grandkids. Right. Car's all running real well. My health's pretty good. Yeah. Complacency, right? Comfortable. What do you need God for? Didn't take them long to get there, right? Didn't take them long to get there. So what happens is they abandon God. They get intrigued by the gods of the land, right? Their gods were Baal and Ashtoreth, and our gods are comfort, efficiency, control, quietness, lack of chaos, health, good doctors. I'm not calling you a god, Curtis, but you know. But, all right. Idols. It's the good life. I don't need God. So God gets angry at that. He takes great offense. Again, not at the Canaanites, at the covenant people. Think about who was Jesus the hardest on in his ministry? It wasn't the tax collector, right? Or the sinner on the street. It was the religious elite who had it so figured out, they didn't need God, right? They got it all figured out. Just follow the plan, right? Just follow the rules. So God turns his hand, and that means favor, right? And you know what God does? God sends oppressors. Shake you up. Get you uncomfortable. Make you call on that little statue in your corner and see what happens. Right? Make you watch the market take a 50% dip in one day. Not that I'm predicting that. Could happen. Right. And you know why God does that? It's not because he hates Israel or because he hates Canaanites. He does it because he loves Israel. Hey, we're in this thing called a covenant. I'm in and you're out. I want you back in. So God sends oppressors. And then we get to that kind of fourfold pattern that happens. Evil is embraced. I think it comes as an outflow of complacency. Idolatry is what it looks like. God's anger is aroused. An oppressor is sent to get your attention, to move you toward a posture of repentance. That's God's anger or punitive judgment. Then God's grace comes in the form of a judge, savior, a deliverer, warrior. And then everybody's good, right? There's a repentance period. There's a salvific period. And then you know what happens? You get complacent and you don't need God again. And then you relapse. And it starts all over again. So God sends oppressors, right? Really out of grace to save people from their own devices, to wake people up. And apparently, as humans, we're really, really slow learners. And it doesn't take but a generation to forget what happened to the previous. Talking some in the Hebrews group today. Listen, to try to erase and eradicate your history is a mistake. History reminds us of not only things that were good, it reminds us of things that were atrocities. Right? I'm glad in some ways that the concentration camps are still there. It reminds us of an atrocity, right? But when we forget, we want to just put that out of our memory and just get complacent and live the good life and only think about rainbows and butterflies. And that's comforts the good life. It's easy to slip away. It's easy to say, I don't need God anymore. I got it all, right? Which that becomes what happens in Judges. Humanism. I'll just do what's right in my own eye. And when there's, 25 of us in this room today? 20, 25? If we all do that, then what's life look like? It is a mess, isn't it? What's your household look like when everybody's doing their own thing? You may think it's nice for a minute, right? No kids saying, hey mom, hey mom, hey mom, hey mom. It's not much of a life. So, all right, man, that was a lot tonight. So the plan going forward is look at the Judges. We'll do this topically. Yep.
Trying to pull it off.
Go ahead.
I don't think you probably went up and asked any of them, like, do you still believe in God? Do you still worship God? Do you still follow God? They would probably all say yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But something crept into their life, and over a couple of generations, they were like, I think this is normal.
Right.
And so God said, you were so far from what I asked for. And I have to look at my own life and say, have I let things slip? Have I talked myself into not holding fast to some of the things that God has asked me to do? And I think that's, where America is. And I don't want to go down the path if you don't want to, but I think it has to be said that we have to wake up and as Christians and get out of our slumber and look at what God has asked us to, because I think the world religion today and Christianity, in whatever form it is, has let things slip into, and we've allowed, say we as a whole, as Christians, the world over, have talked ourselves into allowing things into God's church. And I think that's through the ages and through generations into this. And we need to get out of ourselves. We need to be on that fire.
Right. And remember, these are God's people who have to do it, right? God's not addressing in this book the people outside the covenant. He's addressing the covenant people. And this book is for us, right? We're the covenant people. I agree with you, Brandon. That the more complacent that we get, and the more in calling it the good life, right? The further we get away from God. And it's not in. I don't think it's. We don't wake up one day and say that, right? Israel doesn't wake up one day and say we don't need God anymore. It happens incrementally. And that's why I use the phrase that in a post-Christian age. Now, I'm not a doomsdayer, by the way. I believe that when it's dark, light shines bright, right? The problem is we got to make sure that there's, the light's on. Right? And that's, I think, part of what we'll get to in this book as we look at that is about how to turn the light on. Right? And how to find your way out of darkness. And listen, I still think there's hope. Now, this is not a hopeless world. It's a very redeemable world. Just like their world wasn't a hopeless world. It seemed that way sometimes. If you read the last part of Judges, it seems this thing is doomed, right? But God's people are still redeemable. And the Canaanites are still redeemable. But you got to know God. And that's the deal. And not just know information about God. Know God. And know and understand the character of God the best we can, and embrace that and embody that. So, that's a little preview and a primer for the sermon Sunday. I just finished it in my head. Thank you, so, Brandon. I'm going to give you full credit for it. So, all right. Hey, glad you're here. So, what we'll do going forward, like next week, we'll look at Othniel, and we'll look at Ehud. Probably both of those. There's some humor in there too, and then we'll get to Deborah's judgeships. We'll probably spend 2 weeks on Deborah, and then after Deborah, we'll get to Gideon. We'll probably spend 2 weeks on Gideon. Then after Gideon, we'll go to Abimelech. We'll just spend 1 week on Abimelech. After Abimelech, we'll go to Jephthah. We'll spend a couple of weeks on Jephthah. And then we'll go to Samson, and we'll spend a couple of weeks on Samson. So. I will explain what happened to his daughter. I'll give you all 3 possibilities. And then if you press me, I'll tell you what I think. By the way, I've changed my opinion on that too over the years, a bit. All right, glad y'all are here. It's great to see you. Hope to see you Sunday.